I don't know why I agreed to come up here alone. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I just needed a break from everything back home. Either way, I was here now, standing in front of a small, old hunting cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The place belonged to my uncle, but he hadn't used it in years. When I asked him if I could borrow it for a week, he barely hesitated before tossing me the keys. "You sure you want to be out there by yourself?" he asked, but I just shrugged. "Suit yourself." The drive had taken longer than I expected. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was nearly impossible to navigate. Deep ruts and overgrown branches clawed at my truck, slowing me down to a crawl. I had no cell signal by the time I passed the last sign of civilization, a rusted-out mailbox at the edge of a forgotten side road. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was setting behind the trees. The place was smaller than I remembered, made of dark, weathered wood with a sagging porch and a single window staring out into the trees. A cold wind cut through the trees, making the branches groan. I grabbed my bag, locked the truck, and made my way inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the fireplace was cold, filled with nothing but old ashes. The only sound was the wind outside, pushing against the walls. I spent the next hour settling in. I unpacked my bags, made sure the old generator still worked, and checked the water pump. Everything seemed fine, aside from the thick layer of dust covering every surface. I wiped down the kitchen counter, ignoring the uneasy feeling creeping into my stomach. I told myself it was just the isolation, the silence getting to me. After eating a quick meal, I decided to step outside and take a look around. The woods stretched out in every direction, dark and endless. I had the strange feeling of being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the trees, silent and unmoving. I didn't stay outside long. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and made sure the rifle my uncle had left was still where he said it would be, above the fireplace, loaded and ready, just in case. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the long drive. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside, but when I sat up and listened, it was gone. Probably just a deer. The next day, I decided to explore. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, following an old trail that led deeper into the forest. The further I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of my boots against the dead leaves. The trees felt like they were closing in, the branches reaching for me like skeletal fingers. I found an old deer stand, half-rotted and barely holding itself together. Nearby, I saw something strange, a pile of bones, not animal bones, human. At first, I didn't believe it. I crouched down, brushing dirt away from the skull. The teeth were intact, the eye sockets dark and empty. My stomach twisted. I wasn't supposed to be here. I shouldn't have come alone. I stood up fast, scanning the trees. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. I started back toward the cabin, walking faster than I should have. The whole time, I felt it, something behind me, just out of sight. By the time I made it back, I was out of breath. I locked the door, shut the curtains, and grabbed the rifle. I sat on the couch, listening, waiting. Night fell, and with it, the silence deepened. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A knock, not on the door. The window, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest. The rifle was in my lap, but my hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. The knock came again. I forced myself to stand. I moved to the window, keeping low, careful not to make a sound. I peeked through the curtain. Nothing. The trees swayed in the wind, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the dirt. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I sat back down, gripping the rifle until my knuckles turned white. I didn't sleep. Morning came slow. The sky was gray, the air thick and heavy. I stepped outside, looking for tracks. Nothing, just my own, leading to and from the woods. I wanted to leave. I should have, but something kept me there. Curiosity, maybe, or stupidity. I spent the day inside, keeping the rifle close. Every so often, I would check the window, scanning the trees. The sun dipped lower. The shadows stretched longer. That night, it happened again. The knock, but this time it was the door. I sat frozen, staring at the handle. My breathing was too loud. My pulse pounded in my ears. Another knock, louder. I stood up, rifle raised. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Silence. I unlocked it in one quick motion and yanked it open. Nothing, just the empty porch, the trees beyond. Then I saw them. Footprints, leading up to the door. Bare feet, leading up but not away. I slammed the door shut, locked it, moved a chair under the handle. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner, rifle in hand, waiting for the sun. When it finally came, I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag, threw it into the truck, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced at the cabin one last time. The door was open, and someone was standing inside. I didn't stop, didn't look back again. I drove until I reached town, my hands shaking on the wheel. I told my uncle what happened. He just listened, his face unreadable. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You ain't the first." That was all he said. I never went back. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. I never liked being alone in the woods, but I told myself this trip was different. I needed to clear my head, to get away from the noise of everyday life. So when I found the listing for an old hunting cabin deep in the forest, I booked it without thinking twice. The pictures made it look rustic but comfortable: wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a small porch overlooking a quiet, misty lake. It seemed perfect. The drive out was long, winding through miles of dense trees that seemed to swallow the road. There were no streetlights, no signs of life, just the occasional deer darting across the road. My GPS cut out an hour before I arrived, leaving me to rely on written directions. When I finally found the turnoff, the road turned into gravel, then dirt, then something barely resembling a road at all. My tires crunched over fallen leaves and twigs, the trees growing so close on either side that I was afraid they'd scratch my car. When I reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just an unnatural stillness. The cabin itself looked older than it had in the pictures. The wood was darker, more weathered, and the windows were smudged with dirt. The front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. I unlocked the door, pushing it open with some effort. It stuck in the frame like it hadn't been used in a while. Inside, the air smelled stale, like dust and old wood. A few pieces of furniture were scattered around. An old couch, a rickety wooden table, a single chair by the fireplace. A layer of dust covered everything, except for the floor, which had been swept recently. Someone had been here not long ago. That should have comforted me, but instead, it made my skin crawl. I walked through the cabin, checking the small kitchen, the narrow hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was in order, but something about the place felt off. The bedroom had a single bed with a heavy, old-fashioned quilt. The bathroom had a rusted sink and a mirror speckled with black spots. I kept telling myself it was just an old cabin, that my nerves were getting the better of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. That night, I built a fire in the old stone fireplace. The crackling flames helped push away some of the unease. I ate a simple meal, just some canned soup and crackers, then stretched out on the couch with my book. The quiet was still unsettling, but the fire was warm, and I started to feel a little more at ease. Then I heard it, a single sound from outside, a soft crunch, like a footstep on dead leaves. I froze, my eyes locked on the front door. It had been silent all evening, nothing but the occasional pop of the fire. But now something was out there. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing, just my imagination, I told myself. The woods play tricks on the mind. I forced myself to go back to my book, but I couldn't focus. My ears strained for any sound, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just beyond the trees, watching. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sound again. Closer. I kept the fireplace burning, telling myself it was for warmth, but deep down, I knew it was for the light. The next morning, I stepped outside, half expecting to find footprints, but the ground was undisturbed. The leaves scattered just as they had been. I told myself I had imagined it, but deep down, I didn't believe that. I spent the day hiking, trying to distract myself. The forest was beautiful, but it felt too quiet. I saw no other people, no cabins, no signs of life. Just trees and the occasional distant rustling in the underbrush. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something small but chilling. The front door, which I had locked, was slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. The cabin looked the same, but something felt different. I checked my bags, my supplies. Nothing was missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. That night, I barely slept again. I kept the fire going, my ears straining for any sound. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. Then I woke up, not to a sound, but to a feeling. Something was inside the cabin. I held my breath, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows. The air felt heavy, like someone was standing over me. Then, in the dim light, I saw it. The front door was open, wide open. My blood ran cold. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow. The cabin was still, but the air felt charged. I reached for the fire poker, gripping it tightly. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just listened. Then, from outside, I heard it again. A single, deliberate footstep. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys and my phone, not bothering with anything else. I bolted for the door, my heart hammering. My car was parked just a few yards away. The second I stepped outside, I felt it. A presence, something just beyond the tree line. I didn't look. I didn't stop. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I backed up, my headlights swept over the trees. And for just a second, I saw something, a figure, just at the edge of the darkness. Not a ghost, not a monster. Person, standing perfectly still, watching. I didn't stay to find out who they were. I tore down the dirt road, not stopping until I reached the highway. I didn't breathe easily until I was miles away. I never went back. I never even checked the listing again. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't my imagination. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't care. All I know is that I wasn't supposed to be there. The cabin was my uncle's, a rundown place deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. He'd bought it cheap, planning to fix it up, but he died before he could do much. The place had sat empty for years, and now it was mine. I told myself I'd only stay for a few days, just long enough to check it out, decide if it was worth fixing, and then either sell it or let it rot. My brother told me I should just burn it down and be done with it. Maybe I should have listened. The drive took longer than I thought. The road was mostly dirt, twisting through miles of thick forest. The further I went, the worse it got. Deep potholes, branches scraping against my truck. It was clear no one had come this way in a long time. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. It was worse than I remembered. The wood was gray and splintering. The roof sagged. One of the windows was cracked. My uncle had left some supplies inside, but I'd brought my own. Firewood, canned food, a sleeping bag. Enough to get me through the weekend. The inside smelled like dust and old wood. A thick layer of grime covered the floor. A few pieces of furniture were still there. A rotting couch, a wooden table, an old iron stove. I set up my sleeping bag near the stove and lit a fire. The light flickered against the walls, making shadows stretch and twist. I should have left then. The first night, I barely slept. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no birds, no insects. Just silence. Every sound I made felt too loud. My breath, the creak of the floorboards, the crackle of the fire. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard something outside. A single crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Just silence again. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The woods were thick, pressing in on all sides. The air was cold, even though it was late summer. Something about the place felt off, but I couldn't say what. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't a deer's either. They were human, leading from the edge of the trees to the cabin, stopping just a few feet from the door. They hadn't been there the night before. I felt my skin go cold. I looked around, but there was no one, just trees and silence. I told myself they were old, that I hadn't noticed them before, but I didn't believe it. I spent the rest of the day checking the cabin. The locks were old but still worked. The windows were shut. Nothing was missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here, watching. That night, I kept the fire going. The light made the shadows seem smaller. I sat near the stove, listening, waiting. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. A footstep, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out the window. Nothing. The woods were empty. The light bounced off the trees, casting long shadows. I forced myself to breathe. Then another step. This time it was right outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My hand tightened around the flashlight. The door was locked. I told myself that over and over. The door was locked. Something pressed against the wood. A soft, slow creak. I held my breath, listened. Nothing. Just the fire crackling behind me. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't move. Eventually, the fire burned low and the cold crept in. But I didn't sleep. By morning, whoever, whatever, had been outside was gone. I stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. The footprints were back, fresh in the dirt. But this time, they didn't lead from the woods. They led from the back of the cabin. Someone had been here all night. I grabbed my things and threw them into my truck. I didn't care about selling the place anymore. I didn't care about anything except getting out. The truck started on the first try. I tore down that dirt road, branches scraping against the sides, potholes jolting me in my seat. I didn't slow down, not until I saw the highway. I never went back. I never told anyone what happened, either. But sometimes late at night, I still hear it. That slow, careful step outside my door, waiting. I drove up the winding dirt road, the tires of my old truck crunching over loose gravel. The trees on either side pressed in close, dark and bare, their twisted branches reaching toward the overcast sky. I had been driving for hours, deep into the mountains, far from any sign of life. The cabin had been a last-minute find, something cheap and secluded, exactly what I was looking for. It wasn't anything fancy, Just a one-room structure with a lofted bed, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. No cell service. No electricity except for a single generator out back. It was what I wanted, what I needed. A break from everything. From work, from the noise of the city, from people. Just a few days to be alone. When I pulled up, the cabin looked older than it had in the listing photos. The wood was weathered, the front steps slightly warped. A few patches of moss grew along the base, creeping up toward the windows. The air was sharp and cold, and the trees swayed with the wind, whispering through the branches. I grabbed my bags and went inside. It was simple but clean. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch that looked like it had been there for decades, and a small kitchen area with an old gas stove. There was a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, running off the generator, but I planned to use the fireplace for light at night. A narrow ladder led up to the sleeping loft. I climbed up, testing the steps, and found a mattress with a heavy wool blanket already laid out. It smelled of cedar and something else, something faint but sharp, like old sweat. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, cooked some canned soup, and read a book by flashlight. The silence was heavier than I expected. I thought I would enjoy it, but it pressed against me, thick and unmoving. I told myself I just needed to adjust. It had been years since I was truly alone. The second night, I heard something. It was just past midnight. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the fire crackle below. Then, a sound outside. Not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps. I sat up, heart hammering, straining to hear. The steps were slow, deliberate. Someone walking just outside the cabin. My truck was locked. The doors were locked. I reached for the knife I had brought and climbed down the ladder as quietly as I could. I moved toward the window, careful to stay out of sight, and peered through a gap in the curtain. Nothing. Just darkness and the trees shifting in the wind. I stood there for what felt like an hour, waiting, listening, but the footsteps never came again. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe even an animal after all. Something small. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The third night, I found the footprints. They were just outside the cabin, leading from the treeline to the porch and then back again. Bare feet. The prints were distorted, stretched in the mud, but they were definitely human. I stared at them for a long time, my brain struggling to make sense of it. Who the hell was walking around out here in the middle of nowhere, barefoot? And why hadn't they knocked? Why had they just stood there? I thought about leaving. I could pack up and drive back to town. But I told myself I was overreacting. It had to be some drifter, someone passing through. Maybe they saw my truck and got spooked. I checked my knife, checked the locks again, and forced myself to go inside. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my body go rigid. The wind, the creaking of the trees, the settling of the old wood. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Then, around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. It was right outside the window, long and slow, just past the thin wall of the cabin. My stomach turned to ice. I wanted to move, to grab my knife, but I couldn't. I just lay there, frozen, listening. The breathing went on for minutes, and then finally it stopped. I didn't hear footsteps.
No retreating sounds.
Just silence. As if whoever or whatever had been standing there was still there, waiting. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. When I woke up, the sun was already up, cutting through the trees. I rushed outside, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the footprints were gone. The ground was dry, the old prints from before barely visible now, as if no one had been there at all. I packed my bags in under 10 minutes. I didn't care if I was overreacting anymore. I wasn't staying. I threw everything into my truck, climbed in, and turned the key. The engine didn't start. I I tried again. Nothing. Just a clicking sound, the battery barely catching. I swore, checked my phone, no service. The nearest town was over 20 miles away. My stomach twisted. I had checked everything when I arrived. The truck had been fine. There was no reason for it to be dead. A sound behind me. I turned so fast my neck popped. The trees stood still, the woods empty. But I felt it. That heavy, unmoving silence pressing down on me again. Watching, I grabbed my knife and slammed the truck door shut. If I had to walk, I would. I wasn't staying here another night. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, made sure I had my flashlight, and started down the road. It was a long shot, but I knew there had been a gas station about 10 miles back. Maybe someone would pass by. Maybe I'd get lucky. I walked for hours. The sky started to darken, the sun dipping behind the mountains. My legs ached, my fingers numb from the cold, but I didn't stop. I kept moving, kept my eyes on the road, kept listening. Then, ahead of me, something on the ground. I slowed, my throat tightened. A single set of footprints in the dirt, bare feet. They led from the trees to the center of the road, then vanished as if whoever made them had just stopped walking, or as if they had stepped backward, returning to the woods. I didn't wait to figure it out. I ran. By the time I reached the gas station, my lungs were burning, my vision blurred with exhaustion. The clerk stared at me as I stumbled inside, hands shaking, face pale. He asked if I was okay, if I needed help. I told him about my truck, about the footprints, about the breathing. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, then at the road behind me. Then he said something I still hear in my head every night before I sleep. "You're lucky you got out." I had no good reason for coming out here alone. Maybe I needed a break from people, from the constant noise of the city, from my phone buzzing every few minutes. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. Spend a few days in total isolation, relying only on myself. I found the cabin through a website that listed off-grid rentals. It was buried deep in the woods of northern Montana, accessible only by an old logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The description was bare bones. One-room cabin with stove, small generator, water pump.
No Wi-Fi.
Bring your own supplies. Expect solitude. That was exactly what I wanted. I booked 4 nights, packed my truck with everything I thought I'd need, and set off. The drive took nearly 12 hours. By the time I reached the turnoff to the cabin, the sun was hanging low in the sky. The road leading to the cabin was worse than I expected. Narrow, muddy, full of deep ruts and half-fallen branches. My truck bounced and groaned over the terrain. The trees pressed in from both sides, dark and thick. I kept driving, watching the GPS count down the miles, hoping the cabin was worth it. When I finally arrived, the place was even smaller than the photos had made it seem. A simple wooden structure, a single window in the front, a porch that sagged slightly. The roof looked intact, the walls solid. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. There was a small shed a few feet away, probably for firewood. Beyond that, nothing but trees stretching out in every direction. I got out of the truck and stretched. The air was crisp, colder than I expected for late September. The silence was total. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of machinery. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I grabbed my duffel bag and stepped up onto the porch. The door was unlocked, just as the owner had said it would be. Inside, the place was simple. A wood stove in the corner, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a small table with 2 chairs, and a kitchenette with a propane stove and a few shelves. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, connected to the generator out back. I spent the first hour settling in, stacking the firewood near the stove, unloading my cooler, making sure the generator worked. I checked my phone one last time before shutting it off. Zero signal. I hadn't expected any, but it still felt strange knowing I was completely cut off. As the sun dipped below the trees, the cabin quickly filled with shadows. I started a fire in the stove, the dry wood catching fast, the warmth spreading through the small space. I sat at the table, ate a sandwich, listened to the fire crackle. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the adjustment to being alone. My mind, so used to constant input, was trying to fill the silence with unease. That's all it was. I told myself that and went to bed early, determined to wake up refreshed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. Not loud, not obvious. Just something subtle, just enough to pull me from sleep. I stayed still, listening. The fire had died down, the only light coming from the embers. Then I heard it again. A soft scrape, like something moving against the cabin wall. A branch, I told myself, or an animal, maybe a raccoon. But then it came again, and this time it was followed by a dull thud, like a heavy footstep on the porch. I sat up, my heart hammering. I reached for the flashlight beside the cot and flicked it on. The beam wavered as I aimed it at the window, but all I saw was darkness. The porch was empty. I forced myself to lie back down, telling myself I was being stupid. I was out in the woods. There were animals everywhere, maybe even a bear. But that didn't make me feel any better. I lay there wide awake, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked around the cabin. The ground was damp from the night's dew, but I didn't see any tracks on the porch. I told myself I had imagined the sound, that my mind had played tricks on me in the dark. I shook it off, made coffee, and decided to explore the area. The forest was dense, the trees packed close together, their trunks rough and gray. I followed a narrow deer trail for a while, enjoying the quiet, trying to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. But the further I went, the stronger it got. A nagging sense that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. I stopped and turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the wind. But the feeling wouldn't leave. I headed back to the cabin, walking faster than I meant to. That night, I locked the door, something I hadn't bothered to do the night before. I kept the fire burning, kept the flashlight beside me. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the unease. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. A sound just outside. A slow, deliberate step on the porch. Then another. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers ached. The doorknob rattled. I bolted upright, my heart slamming against my ribs. The door was locked. Nothing could get in. I forced myself to breathe. The rattling stopped. Then I heard the footsteps move away. Not fast, slow, like whoever or whatever it wasn't in a hurry. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stepped onto the porch, my body tense, expecting to see something. Footprints, scratches, some sign of what had been there. But there was nothing. The dirt was undisturbed. The air was still. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my stuff, threw it in the truck, and started the engine. The relief was immediate, but it didn't last. As I drove down the narrow road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something move between the trees. A shadow too tall, too thin. Watching. Then it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was 100 miles away. I never planned to stay in that cabin for long. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, just a quiet getaway from work and the constant buzz of city life. I had rented it through a local listing, some old place deep in the woods of northern Michigan, far enough from civilization that cell service was spotty at best. That was part of the appeal. Just me, the trees, and a chance to clear my head. The drive up was uneventful, just miles of winding roads through dense forest. I passed through a small town about 40 minutes from the cabin, stocked up on groceries and firewood, then continued on. The last stretch was a dirt road, barely wide enough for my truck, lined with towering pines that swallowed the sky. The moment I turned onto it, I felt uneasy. The road felt too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the unnatural kind, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I shook it off. I was just tired. The cabin itself was small, older than I expected but well maintained. It sat in a small clearing, backed up against the forest, with a narrow creek cutting through the property. The owner had left the key under a loose rock by the door, just like they said they would. Inside, the place was simple: wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. Everything smelled like old wood and dust, but it was comfortable enough. I dropped my bags, put the groceries away, and decided to check out the area before the sun set. There was a hiking trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the forest. I followed it for a while, listening to the wind moving through the trees, the occasional rustle of some small animal darting through the undergrowth. The longer I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched, not by something in the trees, but by the trees themselves. I laughed at the thought. Too many horror movies. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I turned back after about an hour. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. I made dinner, just a simple meal, heated up some canned soup, and sat by the fireplace with a book. The silence of the place should have been relaxing, but it wasn't. Every now and then, I'd catch myself listening, waiting for a sound that never came. That night, I barely slept. The bed was comfortable enough, but the woods outside were too quiet. I kept waking up, staring at the ceiling, feeling like something was just outside, watching. Around 3 a.m., I heard something, a thud, not loud, but enough to jolt me awake. It sounded like it came from outside, near the back of the cabin. I stayed still, heart pounding. Then another thud, closer this time. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer walking through the clearing, maybe a raccoon knocking something over. But I didn't go back to sleep. The next morning, I found something strange near the edge of the trees. Footprints, not animal prints, human, barefoot. They led from the tree line to the back of the cabin, then disappeared. No tracks leading away. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were old. Maybe the wind had covered the exit tracks. I spent the day trying to shake it off. I hiked a little, chopped some wood, read by the fireplace, but the uneasy feeling never left. That night, I locked the door, shut the windows, and kept the fire going as long as I could. Sleep didn't come easy. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound, a soft tapping, not at the front door, but at the window beside the bed. I turned my head slowly. Through the glass, I saw nothing but darkness, just the trees and the faint reflection of the fire's glow. I held my breath, listening. Top, top, top. I reached for the flashlight beside the bed, clicked it on, and aimed it at the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty clearing outside. No footprints, no movement, but I knew what I had heard. The rest of the night, I sat awake, gripping the flashlight, jumping at every creak of the cabin. The wind had picked up, whispering through the trees like voices just out of reach. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone out there. The next morning, I packed up. I didn't care that I had another night booked. I was leaving. As I loaded my truck, I felt eyes on me, not from the trees, but from the cabin itself. I turned and stared at the window by the bed. The window I had locked the night before was open. I didn't check inside. I didn't want to know. I got in my truck, started the engine, and didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back, never contacted the owner, never looked up the history of that place. I don't want to know. Some places aren't meant to be stayed in. Some places remember you long after you've gone. I took the cabin rental without thinking too much about it. The pictures looked fine, rustic, a little worn but charming, tucked away in the woods with a decent-sized lake nearby. I needed the break. Work had been draining me, and I couldn't stand the thought of another weekend wasting away in my apartment, staring at my phone and ignoring messages. I wanted silence. I wanted to breathe without feeling the weight of 100 tiny responsibilities clawing at me. The drive out there was uneventful. 3 hours from the city, mostly highway, then a long stretch of winding roads through dense trees. The last couple of miles were rough, just dirt and gravel with deep ruts that made my tires slip if I took them too fast. I got there in the early evening, just before sunset. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. It was cooler than I expected, even though it was the middle of summer. The cabin itself was smaller than I thought, but that was fine. A single-story structure with a covered porch, dark wood, and a slanted roof. The windows were small, and the only light came from the porch bulb, which flickered weakly when I switched it on. Inside, it smelled old, wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. There was a small kitchenette, a worn-out couch, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a single bedroom with a bed that creaked when I sat on it. The place was clean enough, though, not cozy, but livable for a weekend. The first night was fine. I made a quick dinner, read a little, and went to bed early. The quiet was strange at first, too deep, but I figured I'd get used to it. I left the bedroom window cracked open, listening to the sound of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves. I fell asleep easily. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was something else, a feeling. My skin was cold, and I had this odd sense that something was off. I stayed still, listening. The woods were silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. I strained to hear anything, but all I could pick up was the faint sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the unfamiliarity of the place messing with me. But when I got up to use the bathroom, I felt it again. That strange, crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I checked the window before going back to bed, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the trees. The next morning, I shook it off. I made coffee, sat outside for a bit, and decided to take a walk down to the lake. It was about a 10-minute walk through the woods, the path uneven and narrow. The lake was still and gray, the surface barely rippling despite the light breeze. I stood there for a while, breathing it in. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. There was something about the stillness that put me on edge. I spent the afternoon fishing off the small dock behind the cabin. Didn't catch much. I kept glancing toward the tree line, though, feeling that same uneasy sensation from the night before. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I hadn't seen anything. There was no reason to be nervous. That night, the unease got worse. I locked the door, checked the windows, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. I sat in the living room, the only light coming from the single lamp by the couch, trying to read. Every so often, I'd glance toward the window. Nothing, just darkness. But I felt it, something watching. Not just that, something waiting. I decided to go to bed, figuring I was just exhausted. I woke up again around 2 a.m. This time there was a sound. A faint crunching outside. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't an animal. The steps were slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding. The window was still open a crack, and through it, I heard the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, close. I didn't move. My mouth went dry, and I felt this overwhelming sense that if I made a noise, if I even exhaled too loudly, whoever or whatever was out there would know I was awake. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, my muscles aching from the tension. Eventually, the breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I went outside, half expecting to find nothing. But there, in the damp earth beneath my bedroom window, were footprints. Human, barefoot. The prints led away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. I packed my things. Fast. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I threw everything into my bag, locked the door behind me, and got into my car. The drive back felt longer, like the road had stretched overnight. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the distance, watching me leave. When I got home, I looked up the area. No missing persons, no strange reports, nothing to explain what had happened. Just a quiet patch of woods with an old cabin for rent. I haven't gone camping since.